one of the guys who was running Fort Smith, a guy called Pookies, took it upon himself to confront Waiyaki. They got into a fight. Waiyaki did overcome this rather weak Mzungu fella called Pookies. He was going to dispatch him to the next world. My name is Njoroge Regeru. Professionally, I'm a lawyer. I'm a practicing advocate. On the side, I have side interests, and part of those have included researching and writing the book that brings us here today. This is Muthamaki Waiyaki Hinga, a book that traces the roots of this patriarch. He was a leader amongst his people. He was recognized for his bravery, for his leadership, and for the sheer audacity that he exhibited in confronting the colonialists very early on, at a time when, in fact, there was no movement to try and sit the colonialists who are wreaking havoc in the country. And Waiyaki, from amongst so many hundreds and thousands of people, came to the forefront. He was recognized by his people, his peers. He was made a leader amongst them, and he championed and spearheaded the struggle. Muthamaki Waiyaki Hinga is actually the pioneer freedom fighter. If you look at the years when he operated, leading up to his death in 1892, 6th of September 1892 is when he died, then you can see he was ahead of his time. You have had some other exemplary leaders and freedom fighters like Dedan Kimathi, but those came much, much, much later. I mean, Kimathi, without meaning to take anything from him, was stirring and doing great things during the Mau Mau era in the 50s. But you can see Waiyaki had featured much, much earlier, and he was therefore a pioneer freedom fighter. He ignited in many ways the flame that sparked and led to the rebellion that culminated in the 1950s in the Mau Mau movement that drove away the white man from our lands. From the very first chapters, we trace his origins and how he even landed here in the first place. And it is true that he had emigrated from Maasai land with his, and this is now I'm talking about his father, because we have to trace back to Waiyaki's father. This is Hinga. Hinga had emigrated from Maasai land at a time when he was a wanted man. In a confrontation with a certain Maasai man, he had killed him, and the community there was up in arms against him. And his mother grabbed him and said, look, we better run for dear life. And they set out to come to, this is in the 1820s, 1830s, to come to Kikuyuland to take refuge. And they came to the Gathecha family, which hosted him and adopted him. And with time, he started expanding. This is Hinga Waiyaki. And with his many wives, he then started procreating. And that is where, from amongst his many sons, you had this bright spark, Waiyaki, who would then become subsequently the leader of these people, who would become Muthamaki and lead his people to rebellion and eventually to confront the white man. The IBA, and we have dealt with it quite a bit in our book, found a person who was well entrenched in leadership amongst his people, well respected, and who was looked upon by his people for guidance and direction in many ways. So as these people, remember, the IBA was largely a trading outfit that moved goods and merchandise from the coast across and to neighboring countries, Uganda and so on. And they needed outposts as they traversed through this region. And in our region, the region that is under consideration in this book, Waiyaki was king. Waiyaki ruled the terrain. So if you wanted peace, if you wanted security, If you wanted safe passage, then the man to talk to was Waiyaki, and invariably you had to talk to him and get to get to some kind of pacts with him. That is why, for instance, you have Waiyaki getting into a pact, the friendship pact with Lugard at some point, where there was going to be mutual recognition and mutual respect. You do your thing, I do my thing. And these Wazungus obviously needed that kind of protection because in terms of numbers, they were hugely outnumbered. Of course, they had sophisticated arms and so on, but you did need that kind of support. And Waiyaki did provide it, and he expected reciprocity, he expected mutual respect. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, and that is how you found that subsequently there were confrontations that led into disastrous results. That pact did not last for very long. And from all accounts, it would appear that Lugard dishonored this pact. Waiyaki expected, so did his people, that they would be treated with respect, they would be allowed to carry on with their established traditional way of life and so on. But the Muzungu had other thoughts. They started encroaching on our values, our traditions. They started harassing our beautiful girls and so on. And Waiyaki wouldn't have any of this. So even the warriors wouldn't have any of this. And it is not surprising, therefore, that pact very quickly degenerated. When you consider that there was a falling out in pacts such as this, in the relationships between local leaders like Waiyaki and others, invariably this had to lead to violence. You had it in the blockade, you had it in the Lari massacre and things like those. And this was the Muzungu in desperation trying to assert now his control through force, because obviously he had superior firepower in terms of ammunition and so on, which we didn't have. Or what he had encountered on was the determination, the sheer determination and spirit of our people to resist and to rise and to assert their land, to assert their interests, particularly as far as land was concerned. It was always a very touchy subject. And they felt that they were prepared to lay down their lives to protect their land. So when the history of freedom struggle and the liberation movement is written, the blockade has to feature prominently. And other incidents that I have documented in this book. These are the milestones, these are the building blocks upon which the struggle was erected, was built, and eventually we realized our freedom. Fort Smith is central in this book. In fact, if you look at the cover, the building you see right at the cover is the Fort Smith building in a place called Fort Smith, not too far from here. Duboine, on your way to Gitaro, that is where you have Fort Smith. And it is a shame that so many decades after our independence, the place is still called Fort Smith because of Major Eric Smith, who established it. And again, it was an outpost by the Wazungus. It was meant to be a place. The word fort, as you might appreciate, connotes some kind of security hold, doesn't it? It is a fort which should afford you protection and security, where you can put your merchandise and be safe and secure and so on. So this guy, Smith, put it up there with his people. By the way, he was one-armed. He didn't have one hand, so he was christened Yekono, meaning one-handed guy. And the whole point was to operate from Fort Smith, use it as a point of influence and protection from his people, and from there, of course, try to dictate things to the people around there. And because it was smack in the heartland of Kikuyuland, then it meant that it was right in Waiyaki's turf. It was in his neighborhood, and so you had to deal with him. And initially, from all accounts, the relationship was cordial. They were getting along very well and so on, but something went disastrously wrong at some point. And one of the guys who was running Fort Smith, a guy called Pukis, took it upon himself to confront Waiyaki. There are different versions of what happened, but the end result is that they got into a struggle. They got into a fight. Waiyaki did overcome this rather weak Mzungu fella called Pokis. He was going to dispatch him to the next world, but his guards came and wrestled Waiyaki down. They held him overnight at the fort, and in fact, that Fort Smith had within the compound what you might call a cell, a prison cell, where they used to incarcerate people overnight and torture them and do all sorts of things to them. And there was also an outhouse that was used as a courtroom. In fact, when we visited this place for the first time in 2014, we christened that place The Hague, because that room reminded you very much of what was going on at The Hague. And so Waiyaki was tied to a lamppost, a tree, outside the fort overnight, and he was then subjected to what you could call a kangaroo court, where he was tried, if we can call that a trial, and eventually they found him guilty, and the sentence that was meted out to him was that he should be deported, he should be banished from that area and shipped down to the coast somewhere. And that is how the trek from Fort Smith to Kibwezi started. And the story goes that then when he got to Kibwezi, they decided to actually kill him. And the story goes that Waiyaki was actually buried alive, upside down at Kibwezi. There are all sorts of folklore stories and songs that were then that people have been singing over the years. But again, in fairness, you also have conflicting stories. Some say no, he was shot, then they buried him there. Others say no, he got very seriously ill on his way to Kibwezi, had very severe diarrhea and so on. It overcame him, he died. But the long and short of it, and this is common ground, is that he died and was buried at Kibwezi. And so you can see the connection, the very central role that Fort Smith did play in Waiyaki's life, particularly at this later stage, when now the Mzungu decided that they needed to get rid of him. He was probably far too influential, far too daring, far too brave for them, and they needed to contain him before this fire spread. And as indeed it did much later when Mau Mau really took root in our land. The rise and eventual fall of Waiyaki did trigger a wave of a generation of other leaders who came up, and they felt that they had to carry on the struggle. Waiyaki had started it. It snowballed into other people who came up and they took up the call. And that is why eventually it seemed to acquire a life of its own, leading to the Mau Mau rebellion as we know it. Despite the tremendous sacrifices that were made by him and even the larger family, that in terms of recognition, there is hardly anything at all. There is reason for us to pause and reflect and look back and see, have we done right? Have we been fair and just to those stalwarts, those warriors who championed the struggle, who are very selfless in this, who are very brave? I mean, look at what they had to come up against: rudimentary weapons, against pretty sophisticated weapons by these Mzungus, their communities being interfered with, being molested, being, it was a horrendous situation. And, you didn't have, say, some national force or anything behind these tribal leaders. They had to improvise and do it themselves and carry on the struggle and hope that somehow it ends up in a good place. It did eventually, but at horrible, horrible cost to them and their families. And I think the very least that anybody would expect is that there is due recognition of efforts such as this. Fort Smith, you cannot talk about Waiyaki and not talk about Fort Smith. And to the credit of the government, back in 2005, that site was actually gazetted as a national monument. So this building that you see on the cover of my book is, by dint of that gazette notice, supposed to be a national monument preserved for posterity and so on. But the reality on the ground is that the place is in a shambles. It is dilapidated. Nobody minds it. We need to resist this idea of tokenism, that you think that it is sufficient to just gazette Fort Smith. That should only be the beginning. You must go a bit further and secure the place, give a vote for the maintenance of that place, and then breathe life into it by, for instance, making it a museum where you can have a collection of things, Waiyaki, where you can have a collection of things to do with the community, the grouping there. And it can be a serious attraction, not only for local tourism where people want to see and trace their roots, but even for tourism generally. Secondly, the site where Muthamaki Waiyaki wa Hinga was buried in Kibwezi. As I said, it is common ground that he was actually buried in Kibwezi. How he died may be in contest. Was he buried upside down alive? Was he poisoned? Did he die of diarrhea? And so on. But the consensus is that he was buried there 1892. Now, it beats logic why it is not possible, given state machinery and so on, to trace a gravesite such as this. Look at the Dead and Kimathi story. I mean, for how many years have we had, this relentless search for a grave that does not seem to yield any results? If there is political will, I believe it is possible to establish where the grave is, and that becomes a shrine. It becomes a site that can be preserved again as a national monument in celebration of those people who went ahead of us, those people who laid down their lives for the sake of this country. The fact that a site like that continues to be neglected must mean that we couldn't care less. We are not bothered. It should prick our national conscience that we let these sites fall by the wayside and do nothing about it. Okay? Another site I could mention, based somewhere in Kikuyu near Karura Kanyongo, is a place that was called Gururumoya Hinga, Hinga's Waterfalls. This is where Hinga now used to go and bathe and spend time, and it was associated with him. It bears his name. We have visited it and seen it. It's a very scenic place with the waterfalls, and it is so easy to preserve something like that. Finally, the Waiyaki story cannot be divorced from the mission area in Dogoto. Dogoto is really a corruption of the word Scottish. Scotland, our people couldn't quite pronounce Scottish, so they called it Dogoto. And Dogoto is the genesis of a lot of good things in terms of Christianity, education, the Alliance High School, Alliance Girls, the hospital there. And you have some great buildings there that have come up over the years. You have the Church of the Torch that was put up 1928 to 1933. You have the Watson Memorial Chapel, 1909. Those are edifices, those are structures that cannot be divorced from Waiyaki's lifeline and Waiyaki's struggles, Waiyaki's family, and they need to be preserved as such. We are not saying that they be personalized to him, of course, but every time that those are preserved and you keep talking about them, you take us back to those good old days when people really used to struggle and make sacrifices for the common good. As a country, when we can identify these gallant sons and daughters of the land who have over time sacrificed so much, whether it is the Waiyakis, the Kimathis, the Matibas, the Rubias, the Shikuku, you name them, then the very least we can do as a country is the proper thing to do, is the right thing to do, is the decent thing to do, is to recognize them. The converse then is true, that if we do not honor them and recognize and celebrate them, then we are being indecent, we are being improper. And that kind of indecency can then even be seen in other spheres of our national life. It means then that even in our dealings with the national economy, national politics, we are then indecent, we are not playing fair, we are not decent. It is reflective of a community, the way you deal with your heroes. And I have given all sorts of citations here and what historians have said about people and communities that do not recognize their heroes. Abraham Lincoln said that a nation that does not recognize its heroes does not long endure. And President John F. Kennedy said that a nation reviews itself not only by men it produces, but also by the men it honors, the men it remembers. So recognition or non-recognition of the people who have been heroes and stalwarts ahead of us actually is a mirror of on the kind of community that you are dealing with.